On February 17th to 18th, 1944, the skies over Truk Lagoon erupted in fire as American carrier aircraft launched one of the most devastating assaults of the Pacific War. In just 48 hours, Operation Hailstone wiped out Japan's most important forward naval base, sinking more than 50 ships, destroying over 250 aircraft, and killing or wounding more than 4,500 men. Entire fuel depots and supply stockpiles went up in flames, cutting off resources desperately needed for Japan's defense. By contrast, U.S. losses were astonishingly light. Just 17 planes and 35 aircrew. The destruction of Truk not only shattered Japanese naval power in the Central Pacific but also proved the overwhelming strength of fast carrier warfare, setting the stage for America's relentless drive toward Japan. It was Pearl Harbor in reverse. A blow that turned the tide of the Pacific War and left behind a graveyard of ships, still resting beneath the waters of Truk Lagoon. Today, it was like Pearl Harbor turned around. We were the ones unleashing hell. On their ships, at dawn, on February 17, 1944, our dive bombers tore through the tropical air over Truk Lagoon and caught the Japanese entirely off guard. Beneath us lay the jewel of Japan's Pacific holdings, their Gibraltar at sea, crowded with more enemy vessels than I'd ever seen gathered in one place. I was Lieutenant Commander Robert Steele Henderson, piloting on SBD Dauntless with Bombing Squadron 10 from USS Enterprise. And I was about to witness the single largest destruction of enemy shipping in 2 days of combat. What we did over Truk in the following 48 hours would cripple Japan's naval presence in the Central Pacific and turn their foremost base into an underwater cemetery. 3 days earlier, on February 14th, I was aboard Enterprise as Task Force 58 steamed west through the Marshalls. Admiral Mark Mitcher had put together the most powerful carrier armada in naval history. 12 fast carriers split into 4 task groups, carrying more than 650 aircraft and screened by battleships, cruisers, and destroyers. Our orders were bold and direct: neutralize the Japanese naval base at Truk Atoll and remove it as an obstacle to our push across the Central Pacific. Truk wasn't an ordinary outpost. Since seizing it from Germany in the last war, the Japanese had been turning the vast coral atoll into a fortress, sitting in the Caroline Islands, about 1,500 miles southwest of Guam. Truk Lagoon formed a ring of coral isles around a basin roughly 40 meters across and 200 feet deep. The Japanese had established airfields, fuel dumps, repair yards, and anchorages there enough to support their combined fleet. U.S. intelligence put more than 60 ships in the lagoon, backed by over 40 fighters and dozens of anti-aircraft batteries. To them, it was an unsinkable aircraft carrier. To us, it was a target. At 0500 on February 17th, I sat in Enterprise's ready room, studying reconnaissance photos with the rest of my squadron. The images showed Truk Lagoon jammed with warships, cruisers, destroyers, submarines, freighters, and tankers. Looks like a maritime parking lot, muttered my wingman, Lieutenant Tommy Rodriguez. All those ships, it's like a convention. Down there, our squadron leader, Lieutenant Commander Jesus, marked priority targets on the prints. Intelligence counted at least 50 major vessels in the lagoon. Warships and aircraft were our primary objectives. Fuel stores and repair yards were secondary. The Japanese had been using Truk as their chief supply hub for the Central Pacific. We were about to change that. At 0630, the ship's klaxon blared. Flight quarters pilots to your planes. This is not a drill. I grabbed my helmet and life vest and ran to the flight deck. Enterprise was already launching her fighter Sweep 18 F-6F Hellcats led by Commander Edward Butch O'Hare to clear the air of enemy interceptors. As I climbed into my Dauntless, my gunner, Radioman 2nd Class Mike Sullivan, was running his checks on the twin .30 caliber guns, ready to make some noise. "Sully," I asked over the intercom. "Been ready since Pearl Harbor, sir," he answered. "Let's go get M." The carrier turned into the wind, and I felt the familiar shove as she built up speed for launch. Around us, the other carriers in Task Force 58 were sending up their air groups. Within 2 hours, more than 400 American planes would be over Truk, the largest single-day naval airstrike seen to that point. At 0700, I got the signal to go. I pushed the throttle forward. My SBD accelerated down the deck and lifted off into the tropical dawn. Tommy formed on my right, followed by the rest of Bombing Squadron 10, 12 dive bombers, armed with 1,000-pound armor-piercing bombs. Aim a heavy cruiser moored near the main anchorage. As we climbed, I had my first unobstructed view of Truk Lagoon, even grander than the photos had shown. The coral atoll ran to the horizon, a ring of emerald isles enclosing a deep blue basin, absolutely crammed with ships. I counted at least 40 major vessels at anchor, with more scattered among the subsidiary anchorages. "Holy cow," Tommy radioed. "There are enough ships down there to start their own navy." "That's exactly what they're trying to do," I replied. "We were there to sink it." The first sign that we'd completely surprised them was the sight of enemy planes idle on the strips. Our fighter sweep had knocked them flat-footed. From above, the F-6F Hellcats tore across the runways, strafing Zeros and Bettys before they ever lifted. Explosions and blazes erupted along the airfields as our fighters methodically wiped out every serviceable aircraft in sight. Still, the Japanese weren't defeated. As we closed on the lagoon, anti-aircraft fire began reaching up at us first, the familiar black puffs of heavy flak, then the lethal tracer streams of automatic weapons. They had encircled the anchorage with AA batteries and were throwing up a solid wall of fire. Flak ahead, the first warned the squadron. Keep tight and follow me down. I eased the nose of my Dauntless over and started the dive. The SBD was built for moments like that, a steady bombing platform that could drop its load with deadly accuracy. As I fell toward the heavy cruiser, I could make out sailors dashing across her decks to man the guns. Red tracers sliced past the canopy, but I held the dive, watching the hull swell in the telescopic sights. At about 2,500 feet, I let go of the 1,000-pounder and pulled up hard, the Dauntless shaking under the G-forces. Behind me, Sully was rattling off rounds into the cruiser's superstructure, his tracers adding to the chaos below. I glanced back and saw my bomb strike amidships. A monstrous blast hurled smoke and wreckage hundreds of feet skyward. Direct hit. Sully shouted over the intercom. You got her in the engine room. Tommy's bomb followed seconds later and blew the forward magazine. A fireball consumed the ship's bow. When the smoke thinned, the cruiser was already listing to port, her bow torn away. All across the lagoon, the same scenes were unfolding. Dive bombers and torpedo planes methodically tore into the Japanese force. I watched a flight of TBF Avengers run torpedoes at a line of destroyers. Running true and straight, and explosions bloomed along the line as they found their targets. The light cruiser Katori tried to break for the channel but was caught by SBDs from Yorktown. 4,000-pound impacts struck in quick succession, each blast peeling sections of superstructure into the air. She capsized and sank within minutes. Taking most of her crew with her, the most spectacular target was a large tanker moored near the fuel dumps. A TBF Avenger hit her on the port side, rupturing fuel tanks and sending aviation gasoline streaming over the water. When that fuel ignited, the scene exploded into flame. Fire leaped from ship to ship, an uncontrollable inferno that consumed everything. It touched. A column of smoke shot thousands of feet into the sky, visible for miles. By 0900, the first wave had finished and we were reforming to head back to the carriers. As I climbed away from Truk Lagoon and looked back, the place resembled a vision from hell-burning hulks. Black smoke, roiling, oil slicks, slicking out across the surface. At least 20 major vessels were burning or sinking already, and more were afire. But it was only the opening salvo. We returned to Enterprise to refuel and rearm while the second wave was already lifting. Admiral Mitcher had planned a relentless, rolling assault wave after wave until Japanese naval power in the Central Pacific was nothing but wreckage. After landing and topping off, I was airborne again by 11 with fresh ordnance. This time our objective was the destroyer group anchored in the northeastern anchorage. Intelligence counted at least 6, maybe more. The follow-up strike proved even deadlier. With their air defenses shattered by the morning's blows, we had far greater freedom to operate. The destroyer Makis took 3 direct hits from my squadron and broke apart in a cataclysmic blast that flung debris across half a mile of sea. Fumizuki suffered the same fate when Tommy's bomb detonated her forward magazine. What struck me most was the scale. This scarcely resembled a pitched naval fight. It was methodical annihilation. Ships trapped at anchor had nowhere to maneuver and became perfect targets for our dive bombers and torpedo planes. One by one, we cut through their fleet with surgical efficiency. Next up was the submarine tender Hainaru, a hulking ship over 500 feet long, moored beside the main subbase with lifeboats alongside a flight of Avengers from Bunker Hill ran torpedoes just as my squadron dove in. The timing was flawless. Torpedoes slammed into her port side as our bombs fractured her superstructure. The Hainaru disintegrated in a chain of detonations that sent shockwaves across the lagoon. By noon, the Japanese were desperately trying to steam their remaining ships out past the reef into open water for a fighting chance. But American submarines lay in wait outside, and our surface forces closed to intercept anything that slipped through the channel. One destroyer nearly made it before USS Iowa nailed her with a full salvo of 5-inch shells, shattering her just outside the reef. The afternoon only brought more horror for the Japanese fleet. When the light cruiser Nak tried to break out with a convoy of merchantmen, she was hit by a synchronized strike from 3 squadrons. I watched bomb after bomb, torpedo after torpedo, and rocket after rocket rip into her until she rolled over and sank in the main channel, sealing the escape route for other ships. What struck me about the afternoon was how routine the destruction became. With Japanese air defenses largely smashed, we could pause, pick our runs, and make sure each bomb and torpedo did its job. It felt less like a battle and more like a planned demolition. We methodically tore down the Japanese naval presence. In True, the fuel farms were next. Those huge tank complexes held millions of gallons of aviation, gasoline, fuel oil, and lubricants, the lifeblood of their fleet in the Central Pacific. Incendiary armed fighters set the storage areas ablaze, and when the main aviation gas tanks detonated, the blast was so powerful it was felt aboard our carriers. 40 miles away, amid the chaos, individual acts of courage stood out. I saw Lieutenant Commander John Phillips lead his torpedo squadron through murderous anti-aircraft fire to sink the cargo ship Akokamaro, which intelligence later revealed was loaded with aircraft engines and spare parts bound for Japanese bases. Across the Pacific, losing that single ship probably crippled their aviation logistics for months. By 1600, the lagoon looked like a maritime cemetery. Burning hulks dotted the water. Oil fires threw pillars of black smoke thousands of feet into the sky, and the blue surface was stained with fuel, oil, and wreckage. Our intelligence officers would later count more than 30 major vessels sunk or wrecked on the first day alone. But Admiral Mitcher wasn't finished. As dusk fell, he ordered something unprecedented, a night strike by carrier aircraft. At 2:20, I launched from Enterprise again, flying into tropical darkness, lit by the flames of burning ships. The night attack was eerie navigation by glare and explosion, but devastatingly effective. Japanese damage control parties were caught flat-footed. The cargo ship Shinkokumaro, attempting to beach herself, took a single 1,000-pound hit amidships that broke her back and sent her under. The tanker Hoyomaru, smoldering since morning, finally went down after a torpedo from a night-flying Avenger struck her. February 18th brought fresh waves and fresh ruin. Organized resistance had largely collapsed. AA fire was sporadic and disorganized, and most of their fighters had been wiped out on the ground or in the morning's fights. The remaining ships were essentially helpless against our continued strikes. That morning, one of the most spectacular events occurred. The ammunition ship, Kokomaro, burning since a torpedo strike the previous day, reached her magazine and detonated. The resulting blast produced a mushroom cloud that shot over a mile into the air and scattered debris across the lagoon. The shockwave shattered windows on vessels 10 miles away and was felt aboard our carriers on the horizon. After that, it was systematic annihilation. Merchantman, auxiliaries, submarines, small craft, nothing afloat, was safe. The cargo ship Sankasan Maru took 5 direct hits and sank at her moorings. The submarine tender, Heian Maru, one of the largest ships in the anchorage, was blown to pieces by coordinated strikes from multiple squadrons. The Japanese desperately tried to salvage personnel and equipment. Small boats scrambled for the outer islands only to be strafed by American fighters. The destroyer, Takakaze, badly damaged and barely keeping afloat, attempted to dash for open water but was intercepted by dive bombers just outside the reef and went down with all hands. By the afternoon of February 18th, Truk Lagoon had been transformed from Japan's premier naval base into a smoking ruin. Oil slicks and floating wreckage covered the water. Superstructures jutted from the sea, and fires still burned on islands where fuel depots had been hit. The air reeked of burning oil and cordite. Our final strikes of the day hammered the remaining infrastructure, pier yards, dry docks, administrative buildings, and anything that might sustain the Japanese Navy. The aim was simple: make Truk so thoroughly wrecked that rebuilding it into an operational naval base would take months or even years. By the time Task Force 58 pulled away from Truk on the evening of February 18th, the scale of what we'd done was obvious. Intelligence put the tally at more than 50 Japanese vessels sunk or wrecked, including 2 light cruisers and 4 destroyers, and upwards of 250 aircraft destroyed, most caught on the ground. Japanese casualties topped 4,500 killed, wounded, or missing, and enemy fuel stocks were devastated, with losses exceeding 17,000 tons of aviation, gasoline, and oil. Our own losses were comparatively small: 17 aircraft and 35 aircrew lost over the 2 days. It was a brutally one-sided outcome, a kill ratio better than 15-1 in our favor. The consequences went far beyond the wreckage in the lagoon. Japan lost its principal forward base in the Central Pacific and was forced to shrink its defensive ring, pulling back toward home. The psychological blow was enormous. If Truk, long considered practically impregnable, could be reduced to ruins by carrier aviation, then no harbor felt safe. More importantly, the operation proved the potency of fast carrier warfare. Task Force 58 had steamed some 1,500 miles from its bases, launched over 1,200 combat sorties in 48 hours, and effectively wiped out an entire fleet. Anchorage, an indication of what carrier aviation would accomplish as we pushed toward Japan over the next year and a half. For the Imperial Navy, the defeat at Truk was crippling and permanent. The ships lost there represented a significant fraction of Japan's remaining naval tonnage, and many of the planes destroyed were flown by veteran pilots who could not be quickly replaced. Men who had been fighting since Pearl Harbor. The fuel and spare parts we burned or sank were precisely the supplies Japan needed to defend the Marianas, our next target. As I flew back to Enterprise that last night, watching smoke and flames still reel up from Truk Lagoon. It hit me that we had just witnessed something without precedent. The largest two-day destruction of enemy shipping in the war. What had taken years to build had been dismantled in 48 hours. There was no revelry aboard Enterprise that night. We understood that this victory, dramatic though it was only one stage in a long, costly conflict. The Japanese would withdraw, reorganize, and fortify. There would be more battles, more casualties, and more young men who would never return. True was vital, but it was not the finish line, only the opening of the final stretch of the Pacific campaign. The men who died at True Americans and Japanese alike were fighting for causes they believed in. The Japanese sailors and aviators fought for their empire, their emperor, and their way of life. We fought for freedom, for democratic ideals, and for the principle that nations should decide their own fate. Both sides displayed remarkable bravery under fire, and both paid a steep price for their convictions. What distinguished this engagement was not only its size, but the ruthless efficiency of American naval air power. 2.5 years after Pearl Harbor, we had sharpened tactics, advanced technology, and hardened training to a point where our air arm was extraordinarily effective. Our pilots were better prepared, our planes more capable, and our supply chain more reliable than Japan's. Facing dwindling resources and few trained replacements, the Japanese could not match us. The rusting wrecks on the lagoon floor are still evidence of that February strike, bomb-blasted hulls, torpedo-scarred keels, and twisted metal that tell the story of those 2 days. For those of us who flew above Truk Lagoon, the true monument is the knowledge that our work helped shift the balance in the Pacific. We turned Japan's foremost forward base into a graveyard, proved that American carriers could strike anywhere and at any time, and sent a stark message to Tokyo that the war they began at Pearl Harbor had reached their doorstep. Operation Hailstone was the mirror image of Pearl Harbor. Instead of dragging America into war, it became a demonstration of American reach that brought the conflict to Japan. The fires at Truk in February 1944 marked the funeral of Japanese naval supremacy in the Pacific. From that moment, the eventual outcome of the war tilted decisively in our direction. The young pilots and airmen who fought at Truk went on to further battles at the Philippine Sea, Leyte Gulf, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa. Many did not live to see the end, but their efforts powered the steady American advance that culminated in Japan's surrender aboard USS Missouri. Writing this decades later, I'm struck by how young we all were, boys thrust into the most destructive war in history, often given obsolete gear and limited training, yet somehow rising to meet the impossible. We adapted, we learned, and we prevailed. The wrecks on the lagoon bottom stand as memorials to both American victory and Japanese courage, reminders that even necessary wars exact a terrible toll. The young men who perished on both sides deserved better than to die in the bloom of life, and yet they merit to be remembered for their sacrifice, their bravery, and their role in the fight for freedom across the Pacific.